Right, the next story is it's a very different story. And for this one, we have to leave here. Again, we have to leave Abergavenny. We have to go a long way to a river called the Amur River. Now, for those of you that don't know, the Amur River runs in the most eastern part of Russia along the China-Russia border. And along that border, there lives lots of different tribes. And those tribes, they intermarry, they trade with each other, they fight with each other. And this is a story that comes from there, and from one particular village there. And in this particular village, there lived a man. And the man was called La. But La had a daughter. And his daughter's name was Ayoga. And Ayoga was said to be a great beauty. But one day, someone came through the village and she said, there is no one in this village more beautiful than La's daughter, or in any other village. Now, when Ayoga heard this, she liked what she heard. She immediately ran to the corner of the yurt. She picked up her copper basin, the shiny copper basin, and looked at her reflection in it. And when Ayoga looked at her reflection in the shiny copper basin, she liked what she saw. In fact, from that point on, she did very little else apart from look at her reflection in that shiny copper basin. Although sometimes she would go down to the river so that she could look at her reflection in the water. From that day on, all she did was stare at her reflection, and it was said that she became quite lazy. But one day her mother called to her, Ayoga, will you go and fetch some water? But I will fall into the water. Then hold on to a bush, but the bush will break. Well, hold on to a strong bush. Oh, but it will scratch my hands. Ayoga did not break her stare from the shiny copper basin. Then wear mittens, said her mother, but the mittens will tear. Well, sew them up with a needle, said her father, but the needle will spike my finger. Well, wear a thimble made of leather, but the leather will break. For every question, for every request, Ayoga had an answer. And she did not stop staring at herself. Eventually, a neighbour girl came past the house. She looked in the window. She said, do not worry, I will go and fetch the water for you. And so the neighbour girl went down to that great mighty Amur to collect some water. Now, a bit later, Ayoga's mother began to knead the dough. Then she began to shape them into cakes, but not just any cake, but bird cherry cakes, Ayoga's favourite. She baked them on the blazing hearth. The smell of those bird cherry cakes wafted around until they reached the nostrils of Ayoga. Bring me a bird cherry cake, mother. But the cakes are hot, you'll burn your hands. Then I will wear mittens. But the mittens are wet. Then I will dry them in the sun. But the sun will stiffen them. Then I will soften them on the break. But why, Ayoga, should you work and risk ruining your beautiful hands with such menial work? I should give these cakes to someone who doesn't have to worry so much about her hands. And so the mother gave the bird cherry cake to the neighbour girl. Ayoga was not pleased with this. She stood up, she stormed out of the house, and she went down to the river to calm herself by looking into those lovely clear waters. Much to Ayoga's annoyance, when she got there, that neighbour girl was already there, sitting on the bank, eating that delicious bird cherry cake. And Ayoga turned her head to stare and to scowl at the neighbour girl. And each time she turned her head to stare and scowl, her neck began to stretch and grow longer. After a while, the neighbour girl, she stood, she held out the bird cherry cake to Ayoga. She said, "Ayoga, take the cake. I don't mind." At this, Ayoga's rage grew. She stood up and she stretched out her fingers and began to wave her arms madly. She turned white with rage. How could I, a beauty such as myself, eat a cake that has already been bitten into? Why don't you just go? Why don't you just go? Ayoga began to flap her arms more wildly. White feathers began to sprout from them. As she shouted and she waved her arms, she lost her footing and tumbled down into the water with a splash. As soon as Ayoga hit the water, she transformed into a goose. And she swam around saying, "I am a beauty, why don't you go? I am a beauty, why don't you go?" And as she swam and she swam, she soon forgot all of the words in her language. All of the words except one, her own name. So now Ayoga swims on the waters, and every time she sees a human being to remind them of the beauty that she is, she calls out to them, "Ayoga, ga, Ayoga, ga." My 3-year-old daughter Freya loves that one, and when I get the words wrong, I say, "Oh, the bush has spiked me." She says, "No, Daddy, it's scratched." It's scratched.